Well, hello, everyone. This is Tripp. And for the first time on the podcast, Wes Ellis, author of Abiding in a Man, Prayer in a Secular Age. Wes is a practical theologian, and not just a practical theologian, because not all of them do this. He actually works in a congregation. So we're not going to rehearse the conversation we had about the impracticability of large amounts of practical theology in the congregation that we had when we were both teaching at Luther last year, because now he's going to tell everyone just how to pray. He's going to fix prayer. It's not an easy topic, or it's super easy. But he works it all out in one book, and it's not even that long. It's not even that long, Wes. So I'm glad you're here to explain prayer to everyone, but you don't have to close your eyes while you're listening to the podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Tripp. And I hope that's actually not what you expected from the book, was to fix prayer. But I do hope that people who read it will have a better sense of, maybe take some of the pressure off of ways that they thought they needed to pray, or some of the ways that we have assumed that prayer needs to work, or even the idea that we're the ones that have to do all the work in prayer. I hope this book challenges some of that. And yeah, certainly didn't want to clean it all up in 100 pages or 130 pages, whatever it is. But hopefully the brevity will actually inspire people to read it, because it is short. So, yeah.
Yeah. I am currently in discussions with a number of publishers where I'm kind of insisting. I was like, no, I'd rather just have a series of books, 120 pages or under, with the goal of people finishing them.
Yeah. Yeah. Do the Byung-Hul Chan marketing strategy of one 80-page book at a time, and people actually read them, and they're good. So, yeah.
Yeah. He's also extremely concise in his language.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He packs a punch, like every sentence. Yeah.
I read a whole bunch of his books this past year, and I've been reading him a lot in the last couple of years. And anyway, we don't want to sidetrack on how cool Byung-Chul Han is, but you should read his books. But so in the first part of the book, you're trying to diagnose why, right in the subtitle, why prayer just feels impossible in a secular age. Obviously, secular age there, Charles Taylor phrase. In the first part, you're engaging Hartmut Rosa, has been on the podcast and stuff before, and Andy and I have talked about it and things. When you think of both your own kind of spiritual journey and practicing different spiritual practices and such, and the kind of engagement, both when you've been a youth minister and then a senior minister and such, what are the predicaments that come with this seemingly universal invitation cross-culturally of prayer of some form that are unique to our current moment in the West?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think prayer's always been difficult for people. I mean, we see accounts of that from earliest days in the Christian tradition, especially. There's all kinds of confessions about the difficulty of prayer. So that part's not new. I guess something, as I was thinking through prayer, which really started in my ministry experience, I'll get to that in a second, but I was just kind of disappointed in a lot of the readings I would pick up about prayer didn't really address the why of why this is difficult. And I just thought there would be something really fruitful in meditating on that, and really thinking about, why is it hard? Because we all know it's hard. I mean, if we're honest, of course, you do get people who defend themselves with the kind of, my whole life is a prayer, which is, I think, a way of saying I'd never really pray. But this book came out of my ministry experience of really just asking people how their prayer life is. And not only did I realize very early in my ministry that question in itself is already aggressive. It's, people kind of receive that question similar to the way they probably receive the question of, how is your flossing, from their dentist, and actually a lot of the answers I would get could almost be pasted on to the question about flossing. It always came down to a kind of defensiveness, a kind of maybe a subtle shame in there that they don't pray enough. They're not sure they're praying the right way, or usually it's about how often they pray, the habits of their prayer life. And the questions just always revolved around that. And I just was struck by the fact that this prayer thing has become a source of anxiety, guilt, shame, when I'm convicted that it needs to be a source of joy, a source of, freedom. And that's where the book came from. And it just, my own reading and understanding the water we swim in the kind of secular age. I use that language, of course, from people like Charles Taylor and Rosa. I get it directly from Andy Root. So I do thank him in the acknowledgments that, I'm kind of nodding to his work in that, even though it's not his phrase. But to me, that diagnosis resonates, for lack of a better term, or pun intended, with the way I understand the challenges of prayer, that prayer has become a kind of instrument, a thing we do in order to get outcomes, a thing we have to master in order to become better Christians. It becomes something wholly landing on the shoulders of the Christian individual. And that, I think, is a recipe for the kind of shame and guilt culture we've created around it.
Yeah, in chapter 2, there's this kind of critique of achievement society, right? Where we switch from, you should do these things to, oh, you can, right? It's something Byung-Chul Han talks about. And where then all of a sudden prayer gets turned into a project of self-optimization. Now, one sense of you're like, aha, but in another is that's probably half of religious leaders' Instagram feeds, right?
Right.
Like, and they're kind of pointing out that we need to have this paradigm shift to a kind of poesis of prayer from something like we're trying to make a production to a gift that we receive. So I wonder, in that section, you problematize spiritual disciplines, right? It's like a category that we end up framing it in. You say it might even be an oxymoron. So
Yeah.
what does it mean when you suggest that we stop trying to master prayer? And how does that modern obsession with achievement or getting your grid on poison
Right.
one's spiritual life?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it comes from the kind of secular evacuation of a divine agent, secularization. The immanent frame doesn't really allow us to wrap our minds around the idea that God has any responsibility in this. So the human being becomes the only responsible agent, kind of in everything, and especially in prayer. It seems counterintuitive that human beings would be the ones doing all the work when this is something that apparently God thought up before we did. God invented this, so to speak. And so it is counterintuitive, but that is the way we approach it, is that I'm responsible for it. And when I think of discipline, I may not look the part, but I do have a background as an athlete. I was all through high school and college. I was, football, rugby, wrestling, those kinds of sports. And so when I hear discipline, I think of the kind of discipline, the grit of pushing yourself to get better and running that extra mile because your opponent might not be, those kinds of things come to mind. And, I think in a lot of different areas, people think the same way. If you think about, learning to play the violin or learning to speak French, these kinds of things take discipline in order to master them so that we can become a person who does that, to become a wrestler or to become a pianist or to become, fluent or something like that. And I think because of the sort of evacuation of divine agency and the kind of inflated infatuation with human agency that we have in our culture, the achievement society, we can only imagine prayer as that, as something we should master. And we're not helped by some of the misleading ways that prayer gets talked about, even in some of the monastic traditions, even of sort of mastering prayer. But what the monastics had that we probably don't have is the sense that there is a paradoxical nature to the kind of action that's taken in prayer. That we, as Henri Nouwen said, prayer is a paradox that we have to learn how to pray, even though we can only receive it as a gift. And that I think that paradox is lost in secularization. And all we know how to do is work harder, do it better, and exert more effort, more energy toward it, and then we'll do it. Then we'll be a praying people. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that leads to a place of joy or a place of freedom.
One of the things that kind of came to mind reading this was it's the orientation the individual has in a kind of achievement society, if it's a practice that you're trying to get your grit on, or these kinds of things. I think it leads us to like move past, I don't know, or at least the beginning question of prayer is something like, what's it mean to say yes to a God we can't grasp or control?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And what kind of self is it that says yes? Part of the modern predicament is the kind of the quantitative elements of reality have been so, well, powerful in the modern period, think science, these kinds of things, that the qualitative aspects or the receptive aspects get minimized. And it ends up giving us this belief of like a sovereign individual that's making calculated decisions and being efficient or strategic, as opposed to this is a practice about being a creature woven into an always already addressed person.
Yeah.
Before we speak a word, like prayer is attuning or orienting ourselves to the thick, deep, rich fabric of existence. One, right, that part of our secular context isn't just, right, the fragilization of whatever individual beliefs we might be wrestling with or deconstructing or problematizing, but the kind of thinning out of reality, so that then the justification for prayer becomes a rational articulation of a practice with these set benefits, as opposed to kind of the place in which you're most aware of the what's always already there.
Yeah.
In the kind of the to be human is to be addressed.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so.
Yeah. And that I think is core to the anthropology that sits beneath a lot of the arguments of the book, is that, and I develop a kind of theological anthropology in my other book about youth beyond the developmental lens. I talk about the idea of the human being as the locus adventus, as the location of the divine arrival, or it's a fancy way of saying exactly what you just said, that we are, in being addressed, in being touched, in being seen by the living God. That's what makes us human. And that is very different than kind of meeting certain capacities, or having certain qualities that make us human, things about us. I follow Emil Brunner on his argument about theological anthropology, that the principle is that you cannot look to the person. This is also a Barthian principle, I think, that you don't look to the person to understand the person. You look to the divine, you look to God. And, for better, for worse, that is kind of where a lot of my argument is grounded, in the sense that all of this needs to be flipped on its head, because theology does not begin with the person, and neither does prayer, neither does any kind of human agency. It all begins in God and God's action, God's agency in the world. And there's a problem with that too, because of, like you mentioned before, the idea, the anthropology we always have to fight against, that informs our theology of God, is the idea that the human being is always a rational, agential subject, someone who is, pulling levers or something. And when we graft that onto our sense of God, then even the idea of divine agency becomes even more complicated, because then we get this idea of God as, the agency of God in prayer. And I don't really address this very well in the book. I probably deserves another book, of what is the nature of divine agency, if divine agency is not something that looks like the kind of gritty discipline that we think human agency usually is. I think even God's agency, God's coming to us, should look different in that account of it. But for lack of a better way of talking about it, I think, if at least the paradigm shift of this book is to reimagine prayer not as something a movement of the human toward God, but primarily as God's movement toward the human being. And that allows us to see prayer not as something we have. I think how often in my upbringing I thought about, and even my question to people, how is your prayer life? Is prayer is this thing we have. We have a prayer life, but we need to maybe shift our understanding to what it means to be in prayer, moving from a having to a being mode of existence, as Eric Fromm talks about it. So, yeah.
I had very similar experiences in a congregation. And one of the contrasts I found helpful is thinking of prayer as an act of will, not an act of mind. And because when we think of it as an act of mind, that is about like human intention. Like we're taking our intention, we're focusing it. It's mental effort, concentrating, these kinds of things, as opposed to an intention, which is more of a gentle act of will. This Thomas Keating has a line where he calls like prayer is a soft consent to the presence of God.
Yeah.
And what is it like to rest in that intent, or in chapter 4, abide in it?
Yeah.
Because, why would you need the famous practitioner of centering prayer to explain it when the dude could?
Right.
But coming up with contrasts that just make those kinds of shift, make the experience that you're looking for really different. Because I think it's hard for us to do any kind of soft consent. It's hard to do it with people, right? Like, well, I could show up and talk to you because we have an agenda and this is what I'm going to do, or we're doing this project together, or this together, or whatever. But the activity of just savoring the other, be it friend or family member or a stranger that you encounter and stuff, is just increasingly rare.
Yeah.
And so it's one thing to practice doing it when it's something that's just a part of your relational repertoire, writ large.
Yeah.
But like the number of relationships that take place has really dwindled over time. And I think it's really connected to, you talk about this in chapter 3 around the problem of controllability. Well, let me look at my question I wrote down for this. See, this is what happens when I know the person already. Then I just start telling them what I thought about their book rather than asking them. All right. So but that's the section where you're talking about Rosa, to explain, to kind of unpack the modern malaise and that kind of drive of modernity to make the world controllable. And if you do that, God becomes a thing, and probably a dead thing or an idol. And so how does our addiction to controlling outcomes or even intentions make prayer impossible?
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes it impossible because if the object of prayer is something you are expecting to control, that is not going to be God. That God will not be that. Now, of course, by the grace of God and sanctification, all those things, you can stumble your way into prayer in all kinds of ways, especially since I do believe prayer is something initiated by God. So God always meets us in the imperfection of whatever we're trying to do. But I think if we only the kind of way we've conceived prayer as, the cosmic vending machine or whatever however it's been billed to us, is always, it's often prayer to a dead thing. It's prayer to something you can control, prayer to something that needs to an instrument toward our outcomes. And this is why I'm so attracted to the language of resonance and Hartmut Rosa's language of resonance, is that you mentioned that it's rare, those kinds of relationships that are sort of ends in themselves, uncontrollable sort of relationships. They're rare, but they're also somewhat universal. I think most of us, I would venture to say all of us, have had experiences of that Nova effect, the cross pressure of where the transcendent has come to us, surprised us in moments that we couldn't quite explain, a sense of fullness, a sense of joy, a sense of something deeper. And I try to I use, maybe somewhat haphazardly, but I do try to smash together the examples of Henri Nouwen and Eric Erikson as people who I think both imperfectly navigate that cross pressure. But both of those biographies, I think, are instructive because we see in both of them a sense of a response to the transcendent. And one sort of chooses to retreat to the monastery, and the other sort of retreats to the, nomothetic forms of knowledge and more scientific data. And that neither of that, both of those accounts are more complicated than the way I use them in the book. I think I need to just say that as a caveat that true biographers of either of those men are probably going to have a hard time with some of the ways I use that. But with any book, I think the point that I'm hoping to get across is that we're all fundamentally within this cross-pressured space where we know in our bones what resonance looks like, even if we have a hard time articulating it. But there's a kind of default toward the more measurable, replicable, and reducible forms of knowledge that we want to run to. And so prayer kind of lands within that space. Where anytime we come to prayer, we're coming with that kind of cross pressure. We're coming to it always with the sense of that imbalance or that paradox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, here's something that came up when I was reading it, and you can tell me, Tripp, you're just being way too processed right now. If we think about the fact that we're not separate beings who enter relationships but are constituted by them, then one contrast I find helpful when thinking about control is that if we're always already entangled with God, other image bearers, like the cacophony of life, then consent is not it takes place in prayer, is not the initiating of a relationship, but recognizing one, right? And that move to the recognition of the other is something that muscle is culturally atrophying, right? In a world that looks towards control. Just think of how many of our relationships are pre-filtered by algorithms towards sameness or inflammation of our tribal identity through, a monstrous rejection of the hyperbolic other, these kinds of things. And so to me, one of the things that thinking of that kind of a theology of entanglement and in abiding is where then the self, who when they sit to pray isn't actually the sovereign agent establishing contact. We're already in contact, already addressed, already held. That's in some sense, that's the initial insight of Protestantism for Luther, is like, you are already known, loved, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Sorry. But so if we don't initiate the relationship through prayer, we awaken to it. And that is, at least for me, it seems like a very helpful framing, because everyone knows what it's like to have conversations with people you have shared history with and deeply love, and nothing occurs in the conversation. Sometimes there's silence of mutual, like, because you don't have anything to say. Other times it's fumbling and bumbling. Other times you lose your cool and say something stupid. Like, there's all these kinds of things that take place in that way, but you wouldn't say we aren't in relationship. And yet I think part of what you get at in the first part is, if something we know is something we control, then in a secular age, prayer is impossible. Because if you think it's hard enough to control yourself, now, infinite mystery. Or your kid. Every kid is an experiment in failed control. Anyway. That's something
I was
that
in
kept
youth
coming to mind.
ministry. I was in youth ministry long enough that I can definitely, maybe that's just the mode of existence in youth ministry is uncontrollability. So I can relate with that. I mean, and you reminded me, I start chapter 1 with a quote from Luther that has always stuck with me, that he says, God wants to come down to us. God wants to come to us, and we do not need to clamor up to God. God wants to be with us to the end of the world. That quote from Luther has always been really instructive for me. So I don't know if I'm trapping myself in process. You mentioned process theology before you asked the question, but I agree with what you're saying. And so maybe I'm a process theologian, but
take that as well.
But you got that on record now. But no, I mean, for me, it's certainly not incompatible with a process, a cosmology, or a way of understanding things. But I just see this as a kind of, the sources for my understanding of this go more towards Mon. I've always been sort of stuck in the Moltmann waters, or mud, whatever you want to call it. But and kind of the relational panentheism of Moltmann, to say that our relationships are primary to us, and that that is part of what it means to be addressed by God, is to be caught in the matrix of the divine, the holy. I've been reading Catherine Sonderegger and her systematic theology, deeply profound. I find it, there's parts I want to disagree with and challenge, but she's really hard to disagree with when you're reading her. She talks about how silence is the language of the temple, that to be before the God of the universe is to be beyond the space of words. And I don't know that we have a way of thinking about things in that way. I think our modern epistemology is just where everything we don't know is simply what we don't know yet. And there's really no
Yeah.
such thing as a true mystery, something truly beyond our words and understanding. So we have this kind of sense of like, we're okay with the mystery of God, but we kind of think we're going to figure it out eventually. Like, hey, with enough technology or enough theological innovation, we'll just figure it out. But I do think that part of being in prayer, and Sarah Coakley gets at this, that what's evacuated in true Christian prayer is any sense of the grasping of God. It is always a being grasp. I know I'm kind of drawn into some of the kind of mysticism of that. And, maybe that's dissatisfying to some more systematic theologians, but to me, there's just something really beautiful in being able to confess and begin with the confession that we can't know God, and therefore we cannot know prayer. And we're in the mode of silence. Our words come out of silence, if you're thinking about it in kind of Henri
Yeah.
Nouwen's terms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that even makes me think of Nazianzus, the 5 orations, right?
Yeah,
That he's
yeah,
giving to, essentially future theologians. And like the first 3 of them are basically spent going, well, you don't know anything,
yeah,
and you're never really going to know completely
yeah,
anything about God. So next, we're going to cultivate practices to remind you that you
yeah,
don't know anything. Then, when we're going to start the talk, we have to know that if we do talk, it's going to cohere with God's self-revelation in Christ, which is a God of triune love. But then, don't think that your articulation of it is more than just an articulation of it, because when you're done, you're going to unsay it and then start praying again.
yeah,
And if it doesn't, then he gets to the 4th. He's like, if it doesn't lead you to actually enact that love in others, then you probably should start back over with the silence thing again.
right.
Because that's what the entire point of prayer is, the activation of that which we reflect upon in theology. And I think part of the impact of modernity in general and the last 150 years with theology's like relationship to the university is you can't like walk into a university and be like, welcome to systematic theology. For the first semester, we're going to be cultivating your inability to succeed. And so you'll all be getting Fs, but that's actually required,
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
maybe it's a passive fail class where you have
right.
to recognize your passivity
There you go.
before ultimacy.
Yeah, yeah,
But you mentioned Moltmann there before, and I think this is actually a place all the open relational type theologies would agree, right? That yes, like we know, like cosmologically, there's all sorts of entanglements, that human beings in our interrelationship are entangled selves, like the isolated self's a myth, but also God is also entangled, right? And that God's not an exception to the relational structure of reality, but it's exemplification in the person of Jesus and the triune life, these kinds of things. And if God's not a distant, unmoved mover, but one who kind of feels and is affected by creation, then prayer as abiding or prayer as consent is possible because God's already abiding and consenting with us, right? Like God's already in the flow of sorts. And our opening up to it is answering God's prior constant responsive initiation.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think there's something to the so-called ontological divide between creature and creation that needs to come into play there. That in order for God to be prior to for this prayer thing to be initiated by and prevenient to the human response, there is a sense that that this God is still wholly other, in at least the way I would understand it, and
Yeah.
the way I think Moltmann does maintain that. Whether or not he should have is an open question that I'm sure the process you and your process pals would probably disagree with, but I do think that part of the way we have to sense this is that yes, God is entangled, but only as one who stands without, who stands beyond the imminent frame. And so I think there's probably ways to account for that that don't need some of the hangups that I know I'm holding on to here, but I do think that
Well,
to be addressed is to be addressed by a God who initiates, by a God who is free.
yeah, I mean, a God who initiates and a God who's free is like, well, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what free means, but
Sure.
I like every moment of becoming for a process person is divinely initiated, and there wouldn't be anything but serial repetition without it.
Right.
But I mean, like even like if we just use the analogy of a parent, which obviously that was the master metaphor for Jesus' own teachings on prayer,
Yeah.
like the parent is other and prior and required, and your situatedness is the product of the parent and not vice versa,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, even when you think of in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teachings on like how to pray, like the Father image, or
Yeah. Yeah.
like, well, when you ask for this, like you ask for bread, are you going to give your kid a rock?
Yeah.
Like, so what are you worried about? Right? They're all like so many of the analogies of that exist when Jesus is teaching prayer are ones that the parent-child relationship functions, and it has that distinction in it without there's a host of ways you could talk about it metaphysically, but I don't think, at least with prayer, I'm not sure what the difference
Yeah.
ultimately is, because I'd love for you to talk about like in chapter 4 where you don't talk about Moltmann as your primary interlocutor. It's
Yeah.
the dude from the
Yeah.
Big Lebowski. So like,
Yeah.
how does a dude like help you understand the biblical concept of abiding in the whole
Yeah.
Johannine way?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you do have to be a little familiar with the movie, Big Lebowski, one of my favorite movies of all time, I think. And of course, your first thought would probably be that doesn't seem like a real exemplar of the Christian faith. This guy, who kind of, but what I look at in the dude in the Big Lebowski is this guy who just kind of lives in as the rest of the world is just racing around him, and there's a lot of grit around him, right? The other Lebowski is, you know, guy who brought himself up by his bootstraps, kind of that sense, ironically. But and then his friends around him are just kind of anxious figures, and the dude just kind of lets life happen. And I'm not saying that like we should do that, just become kind of passive, just let the world pass us by kind of a thing. But I do think there is a sense that our epistemology has put us in the position where everything is a must, a can, we have to do it. And everything, Rosa talks about it as a point of aggression. Life is a point of aggression. I have to take it by the horns and go after it. Another analogy I could have used that I thought about was baseball. I know you're a baseball fan, and in fact, what's your hat? Is that the
It's the Greensboro Grasshoppers. It's our
Grasshoppers? Yeah, I've
yeah.
seen them play in New Jersey. They played the Blue Claws up there. So yeah, in baseball, we have in the lore of the San Diego Padres something called Grishtober. I don't know if you remember Trent Grisham one
Oh,
year.
there's at least 2 pages of San Diego lore.
There is, yeah, yeah. I don't want
One
to
is
talk about
Tony Gwynn, and the other's everything else.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So in that category of everything else, Trent Grisham, who is not very good at baseball, but had 1 month where he was really good at baseball, October, and we called it Grishtober. He had this incredible run in the postseason that he just dominated. And they have, that looking at that, what happened with Trent Grisham was he moved from where he was just pressing. They call it pressing in baseball, where you're trying so hard to get a hit because you're in a slump that you actually get worse by pressing harder. And I think that's a good analogy for what we do is we press harder and we actually make it worse. And everything becomes harder and harder instead of easier and better. And what happened with Trent Grisham was he started to let the game come to him, as they say. He relaxed into himself and could just see the ball again. And so that analogy, I think, of kind of letting the game come to you, letting things happen to you, and letting the world come to you the way the Big Lebowski does is an analogy for how we might be able to shift our understanding of prayer. And I'm not saying, I mean, I am an apologist for passivity at a certain level, a kind of initiating passivity, that we are always recipients of the divine grace. I think of the analogy of being born again. Part of that analogy is that you don't have much say in that. The Spirit blows and you don't know where it comes from. John 3's analogy is not one of try harder, believe harder, and then you'll be born again. It's you have to receive this. Birth is something you don't have a say in. You don't ask permission for that. And so I think prayer is kind of that
Yeah, and
way.
if you think you're in control of it, then you're going to ask, so exactly how do I get back in my mom?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You're going to
Yeah,
ask Nicodemus'
question.
stupid question of how do I do that? Obviously, this is not something we have control over. Obviously, we are always only recipients. And that is the paradox of prayer, is that it is something we want to learn and want to position ourselves for. We want to open ourselves, that kind of gentle consent, the way you talked about it. But it is ultimately something we only ever really receive. We're part of. We are in it. Comes to us. And I do also like the analogy of bird watching. My friend Mark Hong talked about it this way originally, or it's where I got it. And, in bird watching, and I actually have very little personal experience with this, but in bird watching, if you try to control the birds or coerce them into coming to you, you're probably going to make it worse. But if you simply stop and wait, you might be surprised to find something. Bird watching happens by disclosure, not by discovery. And we live in a world that is infatuated with discovery. Everything is something we need to learn, something we need to master, something we need to do. And disclosure is more about receiving. And I really think that is a theological epistemology we need to embrace, is one of God's self-disclosure, not our discovery of God.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like the bird watching chapter. In one of the things about it is the language, right, of bird watching is really similar to when you hear like really gifted artists talk about like creation. They're like, what is it like to create?
Being in the zone or something. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's not like they show up to write songs every day, or to write, I'm going to write this much time every day. And then one day they write half their album.
Right.
And the other 100 days they wrote 2 songs.
Yeah.
That anyone ever hears. Or like Stephen King talked about, like when he goes to write, he starts over and over, and then all of a sudden a story takes him.
Yeah.
Right. And if you took the activity of bird watching or songwriting or storytelling or whatever, and thought the results determine whether I did it, as opposed to the kind of showing up and being available for it to happen.
Yeah.
Those are very different procedures.
Yeah.
And I think our period of history is one where we're more uncomfortable with something we could pour ourselves into and get nothing because it's beyond our control.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The whole point of doing stuff is so that we master it, get something out of it. And, this happens in ministry. It's much easier to celebrate the stuff that we can take a picture of at the end that's why prayer probably finds itself more and more on the sidelines of ministry imagination. Is if we go down to Mexico and build a house, I can take a picture of that and say, look what we did. But it's harder to do that with the prayer meeting. What am I supposed to take a picture of people folding their hands? I mean, I don't know what's going on with that. So we have a hard time celebrating that. But the image of creation, I think, is a really good analogy for it, because like you said, the person who puts hours and hours into it, they're probably a lot more likely to have that experience of making the whole album or something. But what's creation, or I think of golf all the time, can also happen by accident too, in ways that you didn't expect. I love to watch golf, and I don't know if are you a golfer at all, Tripp? Yeah, okay, that's fine. I'm not a golfer, but I like to play golf. There's an important distinction there. But what happens sometimes is you can watch, Tiger Woods putt a 35-foot putt, and it's so impressive, and he'll make it way more than me, but I'm actually capable of making that putt too. It'll happen on out of chance. It won't be because I read the green right or something, but it might happen on accident. Same with the creation thing. Like someone who paints every day is going to have a much likelier chance of creating something beautiful. But that doesn't mean that the amateur can't also come to this and find themselves captured by something important or beautiful. I think actually there's an opportunity in AI for us to re-embrace some of this. And you know a lot more about AI than I do, I think, but something I'm really interested in is how quickly our minds now, when we're looking online or scrolling through our feed, we see that AI product or that picture, or we see any picture, and our first thought is that AI or is that not? And we're not impressed by the outcome if it's created by AI. I think it's so interesting that Coca-Cola decided to like make a whole commercial using AI and then like celebrate it as though we're supposed to be impressed. We're just not as impressed by that. But if we found out that a human being actually made that thing, then all of a sudden we're going to become impressed by it. Because what I think that shows us is that we've never actually cared only about the final product. We actually care about the process. We actually care about what goes into and what happens in that space of creating and of moving. And I think there's something to prayer. Now, prayer does have more so than art or something, another agent involved that I think is still hard for us to wrap our heads around. But at least that analogy gets at maybe what it feels like to pray. It's not always about how much time you pour into it or how much effort or energy you exert towards it. It can simply be about finding yourself in it. And maybe sometimes it'll happen when it'll surprise you. And maybe the person who never prays will find themselves in prayer, and the person who tries to pray all the time won't. And we just don't know how we can control that. So yeah.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of that line in The Cloud of Unknowing. By love he may have gotten and holden, but by thought never.
Mm.
And
Oh yeah, yeah,
and you know, where like the path of prayer is not through thought, but through love, and the like the entanglement of a creature before the creator. There's this cloud of unknowing that intellect doesn't ultimately penetrate. We
yeah,
don't like push through the cloud and go, well, here's the syllogism that proves God or explains who God is, X, Y, and Z. We enter it and then discover that God meets us there.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And that, to me, one of the things that I kind of go back to when thinking about that is so often we assess our activities out of what we get out of it, as opposed to what it makes available.
yeah,
And it's true with other humans as much as it is with God, that you could be held.
yeah,
Love can be received, but it
yeah,
can't be like thought.
right,
Like it's not, you don't build up to it and you go, oh,
yeah,
well, after careful analysis, your traits and mine and things, I've decided that we are the perfect match,
yeah,
and this is love. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I always say, like knowing about God is not the same as knowing God. And I use the analogy of like Abraham Lincoln. I I don't know why he came to mind, but if you could know all kinds of information about Abraham Lincoln. That doesn't make him your pal. Like he's dead. You don't know him. Like you can't know him. Or like my wife. You could know lots of information about my wife, and you won't know her like I do, even if you knew
Mhm.
more about her. And so, yeah, knowing about is not the same as knowing. And that is the kind of relational epistemology of the Christian faith, I think, is that we know and are known by God in a way that if it was just about knowing information, knowing about, the Bible would have been written differently, right? Right? I would hope so. Like if it is divine in some sense, then God should have given us a treatise or an outline or a philosophical explanation of these things. But God does not give us that. God gives us a person, events, and people, and that is what we have is relationship. We have human beings. We have subjects. We don't have just the stuff of knowledge. And that I think is maybe, I mean, and by the way, I want to be clear throughout the book. I hope I'm clear that to me, secularization is not like a bad guy. I hope it's not anyway. I think there are books written that really see modernity, secularization as like this horrible thing we should resist. I don't think it's that. I think it's just the water we swim in. And my hope is to find a way, not out of secularization, but a way to be faithful within it. But part of the challenge of secularization is that our knowledge, our epistemology is one of knowing to dominate rather than knowing to participate, to use Moltmann's language there. And that I think abiding in Amen is about living within, knowing to participate, and relinquishing the kind of control that we always want to have, and that we even in church, I think, are often taught we're supposed to have. I'm struck by how many sermons, especially kind of in conservative evangelical circles, become well, and it's not just them. It's progressive mainline churches also struggle that with this obsession with human behavior, that it's always about what you're supposed to fix, you're supposed to do. And this, I think, is why repentance is such a big deal in evangelicalism, and why justice is such a big deal in mainline Christianity. Is we have to figure out what we're going to do next, what is our next step, and that is a different. I think just sets us up for a different mode of spirituality, a different mode of addressing ourselves and addressing God, than the idea of waiting, letting things happen, relinquishing control. Abiding is the language I try to use for that. So yeah, hopefully, like, I think this book hopefully is different than just saying, hey, be more spiritual, or something like that. But I do think so. I hope I have a sympathetic understanding of the world we're in, and what's so difficult about modernity. But it's a sympathetic concern that I have about it, that I'm in it too, and we're all in it together.
You mentioned the book title there. We haven't talked about it directly, but most of the time people think, oh, if you say amen, it's like, oh, signing off, end of prayer. And you talk about it being an act of ceding control. And so can you kind of just unpack what you mean by abiding in amen?
Yeah, it is kind of a strange title, I guess. Amen. We don't usually put a lot of thought into what amen means. We say it because if we don't, people don't know we're done praying. That's usually why it gets said. But amen, its meaning is basically kind of let it be, let it be so. And to say to God, let it be so, I think is an extension of trust. It's a way of saying, I'm going to trust you with this. It's a way of acknowledging God as agent, that God is going to let this be so, or that it will be so in God, in some way. And so I think the language already lends itself there to a kind of ceding of control, a way of saying, I'm giving this to you, God. I trust you with this. And abiding in that's the language. I think abiding, thinking through John 15, abide in me and I will abide in you, this kind of mutuality, I think captures in a more biblical way the idea of resonance, of waiting. Andy talks a lot about waiting for God. And of course, people give pushback to that because it does sound far too passive for people. But abiding is a way of waiting in this trust that we have towards God as an agent. That's really the title could have also been waiting in trust or something, but abiding in amen sounded cooler, so we went with it.
Yeah, no, I think it did. I think it's definitely, plus, it's alliteration.
Yeah, you gotta love the alliteration.
That makes it more true.
Yeah,
alliteration does. So one of the bits about even the framing of it in a secular age, and you mentioned at the beginning, like if you read through just the history of our species across religious disciplines, it's not like prayer is ever, people go, oh, it's super easy.
Right. Yeah.
But it seems that, like one of the bucket of conundrums for prayer are part of our biological inheritance. The way our brain developed, think of like certain churches talk about like monkey mind, or it's not till later that we developed the frontal cortex to reorganize the way we deal with desires. And so there's just certain features of our biological and kind of psychological mechanisms that make that kind of activity, something that is developed over time rather than just like walked into, right? And but then the kind of cultural side, the cultural inheritance is different in the sense, right, at the beginning of secular age, where Taylor's like 500 years ago, if you walked around, hey, do you believe in God? They'd look at you and, what in the world does that mean? Like, the world was, it was an enchanted one. There was a porous self, right? Like between others, nature, divine reality, transcendence, and such. And one of the features that you talk about in the book, you're focusing on Gen Z and it directly, is the way our technologies actually at a rapid pace changing. That it really is like a product of our culture, but it's actually changing the way our biological inheritance gets harnessed. And you talk about, you say that for Gen Z, the world's become gapless, channeling Byung-Chul Han here, where everything's accessible, but nothing is near. And so I wonder if you could say something about how that kind of poverty of experience in the digital age makes prayer, specifically difficult, whether it's a younger generation or the boomers that got too much time on the algorithm during lockdown and can't undo it.
Yeah. I mean, so I think there's a kind of a chicken and egg question about the digital age, digital, networked individualism and those kinds of things, and the kind of modernity secularization that we're talking about here. I certainly see that, and the kind of argument I'm trying to make in that chapter about Gen Z and millennials too, is that they are indigenous to, they've never known a world not governed by this kind of way of encountering each other and this sort of digital facilitation of human interaction. I think what's happened is that we have tried to facilitate concrete needs in abstract spaces. We've tried to facilitate a relationship, which is something fundamentally concrete. Resonance itself is as ambiguous as the term might sound. It's actually a fundamentally concrete idea that it happens in us, in our physical relations, in our physical bodies. And this digital space is far too abstract to allow for that kind of connection. And so I think young people are even more susceptible, or this problem that's true for all of us in modernity. It's exacerbated by the kind of digital realities of the time, and those realities coming to a head now in AI in ways that we don't even yet have our minds around. I don't think. I think the problems just get worse and worse because of that. Yeah, I think the abstract has also created space where all of those impulses towards competitiveness and impulses towards control get even more exacerbated there too. In that abstract space, I am much more likely to operate in abstractions like us versus them. It's much easier for me to place my problems on the shelf of someone else's fault or something like that. And ideas of mystery become even less and less accessible to us. So yeah, I just think it exacerbates the whole thing. And we need to have real sympathy for younger generations. Also not downplaying the kind of meaning making they are doing in those spaces. I think it's easy to just look at that and go, oh, those poor kids, they're just digital society. It's all so bad. Woes them. But we do have to account for that. They are also making meaning in ways that we can't anticipate within that. They are finding concrete resonance within that too. But we also need to recognize that all the stuff we've been, all the modernity stuff we've been talking about is like on steroids for them. And I think it just changes the conversation a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Because one of the things that I've been thinking about and around this topic is the way in which, before a domination system would like take land and conquer it. Well, I guess we might be doing this again, but not because that's the most effective way. But at this point, it seems that the domination system that our kind of technological overlords created is one that annexes human life itself by harnessing large amounts of data and
Yeah.
and the kind of constant extraction of data from our experience is then leveraged algorithmically for profit. And then if you think of the volume of time and the number of relations and what it is we're even aware of that are being filtered by algorithms with mammon as its God and not God,
Yeah.
right? Which is Jesus is one either or. You could serve one or the other, but in the meantime, let's see what happens when our attention's oriented by mammon's, kind of addictive lottery machine. You start to think of that happening, and then go to Jesus explaining prayer, and he says, "Hey, when you pray, go into your inner room." Right? He gives this metaphor for the sanctuary of the soul of sorts, like some kind of private internal space that's where like the reflection and discernment of selfhood happens. And so, it makes me wonder what kind of experiment are we running about our spiritual lives when the inner room's no longer private?
Yeah.
And what happens when the door can no longer be closed?
Yeah.
And I think that's increasingly the case, and so many spheres of our life are forcing the adoption of these kinds of things. Like, take, for example, I upload a book for people to read for class, and now it's going ahead and give students an AI summary that I didn't pick, that's not written by the author, and tempt them just to look at it, put it in AI, and generate a response that then I have to actually grade for a class thing. Right? Anyway, there's so many places this happens. But like when we think of, and it's not just Jesus, like we could run through all the major wisdom traditions that insist that the site of sacralizing our orientation in the world is what you do in your own interiority, right? That interior room space, that kind of like making oneself available for. And it seems that that's being colonized through data extraction and leveraged in ways that are making people exhausted, lonely, burnt out, shallow relationships, but thoroughly fascinated and entertained in the immediate moment. And it's atrophying the powers of attention. It's making us allergic to otherness and thirsting for sameness, like we want salt and fats. And despite the fact those desires were cultivated for a different environment and not the one we're in, right? Like it seems to me that our interiority is we're just getting to a point, in the Gen Z section made me think of this, where you're going to have a generation of people kind of like the post-war generation that didn't know what to do when for $1 you could get a amount of salt and fat that our evolved mechanisms created desires, because we had to kill big things in sub-Saharan Africa 200,000 years ago, and now it's a happy meal, right? Like, and then, look at the volume of diabetes and obesity and all these other kinds of things, and then we're going to fix it with these drugs and all, and I don't think either one of us has to. We have full understanding of what that temptation can generate as pudgy preachers, but to me, that malaise that you talk about in that section, or the gaplessness and what it generates, I think we're just on the cusp of realizing what it's going to do to us as a species. And I don't think we're like, we don't discern whether a technology should be embraced. We discern its uses. And if it begins by seeding our interiority, it makes me uncomfortably fearful and slightly apocalyptic, which is not my normal temptation. Talk me down.
Well, shoot, I don't know if I can talk you down, because I do think, the question is, to me, like, I think it's felt for a very long time like this wave is cresting now. Like, oh, we must be at the top of this. Like, it must be about to break over us, right? And I think people, even in like early industrial age, probably felt that way. And so, but it does feel like it must be breaking now. Like AI feels like a different thing, like it's crossing a different line. But what's definitely happened throughout modernity, and maybe reaching ahead here, is that that gaplessness has turned everything into evaluation. Think about what that does to you when you are under constant evaluation, which is really what it means to seed our interiority. Like, to have, what we're allergic to is any space that's not useful to us in some way. any space that doesn't allow us to either evaluate it for some other optimization, it's all wasted space, right? We can't waste time. And that, I think, prayer is the epitome of wasted time. It's time wasted with God where we simply are, and that just doesn't work for us when we're under constant evaluation and everything needs to be made useful to us. And yeah, I think what that does to us in our relationships with God and with each other is it makes everything about performance and everything. I don't think you need to necessarily take what Jesus described as that inner room as a cosmic metaphor for our interiority. I think it might just mean go in a closet and pray. Like, what does that actually mean for us? It means you want me to go somewhere where no one's going to see me do it, where I'm not going to get anything out of this. Like, it's simply a wasted space. That, I think, is what Jesus is partly calling us toward, is like, go somewhere where you're not going to get any kind of credit for this,
Yeah.
where you're not going to be able to use it for something else. Just go pray. Be in that space where nothing else is. And, I don't know what they use
And
their
where
closets
is
for
the
in
space where we're not being tracked?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like now, think of how many people's jobs everything's being tracked and what's happening on your screen. You have a wearable that's tracking what you're doing.
Yep.
Like the amount of space without the observer chronically, he was like going down.
Yeah.
And the incentive is, well, to be more efficient and effective, we need to track all of this even more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you'll finally have the power to control your soul, and it can flourish into eschatological bliss before you're 50. Did you know that?
Yeah.
That's actually that's what he explains at the end of the book, but we're not going to talk about that here yet.
Yeah. I think being evaluated constantly makes us evaluators. It conditions us. And it's that feeling of like, oh, I'm in the moment. I should take a picture of this, right? And I've caught myself every once in a while saying, I'm not going to take a picture this time. I'm just going to be in the moment, kind of thing. But think about how hard that is. I mean, that's just scratching the surface of kind of our temptation to make everything useful to us. It's like we always want to document it. We want to use it. And then everybody else and everything else becomes that dead thing to us that we need to have it, possess it, and do something with it. And this is where Eric Fromm is important to me. I think moving into the being mode of existence becomes even more and more important to us now than ever, because we need to find a way to you can't get to being from doing. I think Moltmann says something like that in Theology of Play. Like, you have to start at being. You have to start with joy and start with the God who comes to us and is prevenient to us, to use the Methodist language for that. That hopefully takes some of the pressure off, I think, if we're able to move into a space where we can kind of re-embrace interiority, re-embrace wasted space and waiting. And hopefully that allows us to find again something like resonance, joy, abiding, when we find ourselves in prayer, and maybe we'll feel a little bit less guilty about not praying enough or not exerting the right amount of energy towards it.
Mm-hmm. So what did all the effort and energy that goes into creating this book, how did it change you, or as a parent and father, that kind of thing, to within a congregational life? How has working through all this changed the way you pray or invite others to?
Yeah. Well, it certainly has changed kind of how I ask the question, how's your prayer life? I don't really ask that as often as I might ask, I probably move more towards just praying with people. I don't need to know how their prayer life has been. I just invite them into prayer. And that has become a more central part of my own sense of not only my own vocation as a pastor, but my own personal kind of spirituality. I think what I've found after writing this book is I do pray more. I do find myself going into, I have a practice of just kind of walking over to the church sanctuary. My office is right near it, and it's a beautiful space where I can just sit and be quiet. And I just put on a timer and I sit, and I don't have to say things. I just allow God to sneak up on me. That's just been really life-giving to me, and has really become, I think, a central part of all of my process. And I don't do it so that I can preach better sermons or lead better meetings. I do it to receive something and to receive a gift. And I think the same way that being evaluated constantly makes us into evaluators and being instrumentalized makes us instrumentalists. I think allowing ourselves to be in prayer can make us into the kind of people that give other people the same kind of space and allow and begin to value people not for what they can give to us, but for who they are and for the gift that they are in their own individuality and their own diversity. So I think it's just made me, hey, the outcome I got from praying is it's made me a better pastor. It's made me a better person, I think. But hopefully that was not the point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining and writing a book on prayer. It's a dangerous thing to do. Because now you're like 3/4 of the way through becoming a guru.
Yeah. Well.
So,
yeah, I don't know about that, but it was a joy to write and a joy to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to come on and talk about this. So thanks to all your listeners.